As the world marks the 75th anniversary of D-Day, President Trump's curious attitude toward wars and the men and women who fight them was on display again. No, it wasn't another trashing of John McCain, nor did he insult the Gold Star family or suggest that as a businessman he has made a lot of sacrifices too, although that one is a little closer to the mark. Today, President Trump seemed to diminish the idea of service when asked during an interview if he wished he had served in Vietnam or any war generally. The president said that for student deferments plus a questionable bone spur diagnosis later, that he actually has reported for duty.
Well, I was never a fan of that war, I'll be honest with you. I thought it was a terrible war. I thought it was very far away. Nobody ever, you're talking about Vietnam, and at that time, nobody ever heard of the country.
Would you like to have served generally, perhaps in another?
I would not have minded that at all. I would have been honored, but I think I make up for it right now. Look, $700 billion I gave last year, and then this year $716 billion. And I think I'm making up for it rapidly because we're rebuilding our military at a level that it's never seen before.
Earlier, I spoke about the president's comments with someone who did show up for duty during the second war in Iraq, Democratic Senator Tammy Duckworth of Illinois. Senator Duckworth, is the president making up for his lack of service in Vietnam right now?
Well, I don't know how he makes up for it. If you mean by stealing money from the Department of Defense to go build a border wall, money that should be going towards things like, firefighting stations in my home state, then no, he's not making up for it at all.
Yeah, what he says the $700 billion that I gave last year to the military. That was interesting phrasing. What did you make of that?
Well, it tells me that he knows nothing about the United States form of government. It's actually Congress that decides how much money will be given to the Department of Defense. And in fact, it was the votes of the senators and hopefully later on in a couple of months, the House of Representatives that will send those dollars to the Department of Defense. But bottom line, this is a president who tries to convince people that he's some sort of a patriot, yet he is stealing money from the Department of Defense to pursue his own political agenda.
He explains his lack of service in Vietnam by saying, "I was never a fan of the Vietnam War." You are an Iraq War veteran. You were wounded there. Would you call yourself a fan of the Iraq War?
I don't know anyone who's ever served in uniform, especially in combat, who would say that they're a fan of war. In fact, I opposed the Iraq War, but volunteered to go when my unit was deployed. And if anything, I think this president has shown that he's done everything that he can to not answer his nation's call. If he were a true patriot, he would have answered the nation's call, not once, but 5 times, all 5 times when he dodged the draft.
What message do you think his words send to the families of people who lost sons and brothers in Vietnam?
I think it's insulting. I think it is insulting what the commander-in-chief of the United States just said about the Vietnam War, as if it was a choice for most of them. Most of them were drafted and they didn't have a choice to go to serve, and yet they still went. If you're a true patriot, you respond when your nation calls you to duty. This president did not go. In fact, he used his privilege to come up with a story about some sort of bone spurs in order to dodge this draft. And frankly, for those families who lost loved ones who were drafted or those who volunteered, I would find it insulting. My own father served 2 tours in Vietnam.
You mentioned his bone spurs, the medical deferment. He had student deferments and then a medical deferment for the bone spurs. You say on Twitter that he should have received a medical deferment not for the bone spurs. They should have been for that yellow streak, you say, down his back. Are you calling the president a coward?
Yes, he is a coward. He was a coward when it came time to serve in Vietnam, and he used his privilege in every way that he could to avoid going to serve 5 different times. And 5 other young men went to war in his place, and how many of them lost their lives?
Obviously, when we're talking about Vietnam, you know that it is an issue that is fraught for a generation of Americans. Would you say the same thing to others who declined to serve in Vietnam or found ways to get deferments? Bill Clinton obviously received student deferments from Vietnam. Would you use the same words to describe him?
Well, let me just say one thing about President Trump in particular. He's someone who is trying to wrap himself up in patriotism. Everything about him is about what a patriot he is. I mean, my gosh, he hugs the flag as a photo op. And then he tries to minimize his service in Vietnam by saying, well, he wasn't a fan of that service. My heroes are the ones who either responded when the nation called or who stood up and said, you know what, I am a conscientious objector. I'm not going to go. Throw me in jail. Or those who marched in the streets. I also am respectful of those people because they did the most American thing you can do, speak up and defied authority. not what President Trump did, which was to use his privilege to get out of service.
Obviously, the president has also had words with the late Senator John McCain. He skipped a military service in Europe last year. Do you feel, in your mind, does he know how to appropriately honor those who have served?
I don't think he cares. I don't think he cares to honor those who have served because they've done something that he was too afraid to do himself. And I think he finds those who have served to be threatening to him. So he lashes out at them and tries to minimize their service by saying things like, oh, you know, that wasn't a real war. It wasn't fighting the Nazis. It was just in Vietnam. I think he's threatened by those who've worn the uniform.
Senator Tammy Duckworth, we thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.